Starwalker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, a podcast all about tabletop role-playing games from the perspective of the captain's chair. This episode is brought to you by Texas Beard Company. Use the coupon code GameMaster for a 15% discount at texasbeardcompany.com. One of the most important tools in the GM's toolbox is improvisation. Scott Kellogg joins me on the show today to discuss improvisation in role-playing games. So join me on the journey. Together, we can become game masters truly worthy of the title. Hello, listener. Hello, fellow GM and or player. Welcome to Game Master's Journey, episode 45. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. I am super excited to bring you this episode today. I have a great interview with Scott Kellogg about improvisation in games. Scott has been running games for over 30 years, and he's also an improvisational musician. So he has a very unique and illuminating perspective on how you as a GM can use improvisation to enhance your games, and also how you as a player can use improvisation to enhance your games. Basically, if the whole group uses improvisation, it will enhance your game. So this is a great interview, and like I do with a lot of the interviews, I'm going to bring it to you in two parts so that I can keep individual episodes as close to half an hour as I can manage. But we did have quite a discussion about improvisation in role-playing games and how to use improvisation as a GM. It's a great discussion. So stay tuned for the first part today, and then the second part of the interview will be in the next episode, episode 46. Real quick, though, before I get to the interview, I just want to say a big hello and welcome to any new listeners listening to the show today. The podcast has been growing by leaps and bounds. I see new listeners every week. I hear from new listeners every week, and this is awesome. This is great. It's so amazing to have so many new people listening to the show. So if you're new to the show, maybe this is your first episode or your first few episodes, welcome to Game Master's Journey. Thank you very much for listening. So I have this great interview for you today. I'm really excited to bring Scott on. He has a lot of really cool things to say, really great things to think about as a GM. And even as a player, if you're a player listening to this and you hear something you like, bring it up to your group, because it doesn't really matter what game you're playing. Even if you're not playing a game that has in the mechanics improvisational things or mechanics to give players more agency, it doesn't matter. You can make your game whatever you want it to be, right? As a group. So if you hear some things on any of these episodes and you're like, oh, that sounds really cool, I wish my game did that, change it, add it. A great example of that is there are some amazing innovations in 13th Age that I personally really like. However, I'm a big fan of D&D 5th edition, and I really like the system. I really grok it. It's really kind of hits that sweet spot for me that I've talked about before of elegance versus complexity. For me personally, some of the systems in 13th Age are a little too far on the complex side for me, especially when I have 5th edition right there that's kind of almost perfect. But they're so similar that it's so easy to take these innovations from 13th Age I really do like and bring it into my 5th edition game. Or, you could be on the other side of the fence and you love 13th Age, and, like me, you're kind of like, well, I really don't need two fantasy RPG systems that are so similar. They're like different flavors of the same thing. Like I don't need to run a 13th Age on Tuesday and a D&D game on Wednesday, right? There's just, why confuse myself with two systems that are so similar? But you might prefer 13th Age and be like, I really like 13th Age and this is where it's at for me. But 5th edition has some cool ideas, and I'm just going to port those over to my 13th Age game. And that's awesome. And that's really easy to do with those games because they're both based on, Roll20 to some degree, but you can do that with any game. You can take very disparate games, but take an idea you really like from one and use it in another. So I'm going to quit rambling on about gaming because, man, you get me talking about gaming and I just will not shut up. And I will bring Scott on. We're going to open up a hailing frequency here from the Obsidian Monolith and get Scott online. And we're going to talk about improvisation in your role-playing games. Scott Kellogg is joining me on the show today, here to talk about improvisation as a GM. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Hey, it's great to have you. And Scott, you're a listener of the show that contacted me by email, and we've been talking back and forth a little bit about improvisation as a game master. And you told me that you are also an improvisational musician.
That is true. I discovered musical improvisation in high school when I started listening to the Grateful Dead.
Nice.
I'd heard jazz and other improvised forms before, but nothing really fired my imagination in the same way as hearing the Grateful Dead.
Okay.
Which is an improvised form of popular music. And at the same time, I was super into punk rock music, which is not an improvised form, really at all. So both of these things have been very influential in my development as a musician. Presently, I am working with Indiana University as an accompanist, primarily for the contemporary theater and dance department that does a lot of improvised dance, which requires improvised music.
Very cool. Well, I've had a little experience with that myself. I played trumpet in high school and college and did a little improvisational jazz, just enough to know that I'm not terribly good at it and how difficult it really is and how much you have to know to really be able to just make it seem easy.
Well, gaming is the same way.
Okay.
It's like improvising in gaming requires a different set of tools than running something that is very heavily scripted. And I am in no way advocating for the supremacy or dominance of improvised versus scripted sessions. I think they're both very strong in their own ways. But like a jazz musician has to practice the rudiments of his or her instrument to be able to freely express whatever music is coming through, I think that a game master needs to be very familiar with the rudiments of the game system, that is, to be able to effortlessly flow with the mechanics of the game and allow them to fade into the background, but also schooled in the art of improvisation. And the art of improvisation is a collective group activity in which a facilitator, perhaps, or the group in general, is very supportive of each other's ideas.
Okay.
So I found over the years in gaming, and it's been, almost 40 years of gaming for me now, because I started when I was a kid, that there, in the last 5 years or so, have been some very popular games that have improvisational themes built into them. And I think that the poster child for this would be the new Fate core system.
Okay.
Which, if you do it by the book, the whole game universe is co-created by all of the players in the Game Master.
Awesome.
But there's also a new round of books coming out about improvisation. Play Unsafe, for example, is all about collective storytelling. And some major themes of that book come from improvisational acting and this notion of saying yes and to accept what someone else in the group is saying as what their character does, and then adding to that in a positive way.
Okay.
As opposed to just shutting down someone's ideas and really not holding them up and allowing their story to be told.
Cool.
this can get out of hand, and there needs to be some kind of moderation,
Right.
which is part of why a game master is called a referee. So if the game master has specific ideas about where the game is supposed to be going and does have a certain amount of scripted content, then it's important that the narrative is guided back toward that direction.
Now, when you talk about scripted content for a role-playing game, like what exactly do you mean by that? Do you mean actually writing out every scene or just something more general?
A bit of both. It depends on whether you're doing the preparation yourself or you're using a commercial product.
Okay.
If you're using, for example, the recently published Tyranny of Dragons campaign, which you have spoken about extensively,
Yeah.
then you're using very scripted content.
Sure. Right. Okay.
And it's great scripted content that requires a high degree of skill to present in a way that is seamless and has the illusion of the story unfolding as per the player's actions. When in fact, the campaign is very tightly scripted and it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and some very strong locations and set pieces.
Right. Okay. Gotcha.
That is a very different kind of game than an improvised game. A purely improvised game is pretty rare, but it's still possible. For example, I started running Dungeon World at the library in the new teen center that we have recently opened in Bloomington, Indiana. And these teenagers are not very experienced with role-playing games, but they've played a lot of computer games.
Okay.
So they know all of the tropes. They're familiar with Skyrim. They know everything. They know a heck of a lot more than I do about computer games, that's for sure. So I read Dungeon World. I thought it was very interesting because one of the key phrases for that game is play to find out what happens. And that just struck me as very liberating for the game master, not having to front load so much preparation that it becomes stressful in your day-to-day life to keep up with. So for the first session of Dungeon World, I had no preconceived notions as to anything that we would do in the game. No setting ideas, no nothing. I mean, I have plenty of setting ideas personally, but I wanted to try something different. So we, a group of, 6, we created a very interesting, fun fantasy environment for them to probably destroy sooner or later in a terrible, fiery cataclysm. But there were ideas coming out that I alone could not have generated.
Very cool.
And I think that is one of the great strengths of improvisation in a group is the collective ideas of everyone can be stronger than the ideas of a single individual.
Yeah, totally. Now, I know from my limited experience as an improvisational musician that one thing that makes it a lot easier or even possible to do at all well is a very strong knowledge of music theory and the different scales you're in at any given time and what notes will work and what won't and what notes will lead to other notes. Is there any kind of like analogous thing with role playing? Are there certain things you'd recommend a GM know, like going into the session to make it easier to improvise? Absolutely.
I think that you've got to know how the system works for starters.
Okay, sure.
And if it's a crunchy system, then you have got to have ready access to frequently used charts, spells that are cast. The crunchy details. The crunchier, the harder this is.
Yeah.
Because it's not possible for a single individual to memorize every little last detail of a particular system. So, but I think what's more important is just understanding that there is a story that exists between the game master and the players, and that story is waiting to be told. If you ascribe to the belief that there are an infinite number of possible realities, then somewhere the story that you're telling at the table is actually happening somewhere in the multiverse.
Okay.
Therefore, if you can open yourself up to perceiving what that story is, then it is as if your actions are guided by witnessing what is happening instead of a more ego-based kind of thinking, trying to cause something to happen.
Sure.
So that allows a lot of serendipity to happen as far as, wow, I never could have thought something this cool would happen, but here it is.
Yeah.
But you really have to open yourself up to perceiving what that story is, and it will lead you to the next step.
Very cool. That definitely aligns with my experience, because most, if not all, of the really cool ideas I've had, whether for a story I'm writing or a game I want to run, they kind of seem to just come from nowhere, almost completely assembled. It's almost like my subconscious just like spits out this thing and it's like it's ready to go, and I don't have this conscious knowledge of really working on all the little parts to put it together. It's just there.
That is solo improvisation. I mean, you're receiving the information from wherever it's coming from. So if you can extend that concept into allowing each person at your table to have agency to create their own part of the story, then your job as the game master becomes the person who facilitates that narrative and allows each person's individual contribution to be woven into something that is greater than the individual.
Very cool. At this point, I want to break just real quickly to give a shout out to my sponsor, Texas Beard Company, who has all natural beard care products that you should really check out. These are made in hand in Texas. And if you go to their website at texasbeardcompany.com and you fill your shopping cart with some goodies, you can use the coupon code GameMaster at checkout for 15% off your entire order. Also, you get free shipping on all orders over $25 all the time at texasbeardcompany.com. You don't need a coupon code for that. And I use their products. I've used quite a few of their products. My personal favorite go-to Texas Beard Company product is their Big Thicket Beard Oil, which has cedarwood and pine essential oils in it. It smells great, and it keeps my beard super soft and feeling and looking great. And if you would like to see my beard in action, head over to the new Patreon page at patreon.com/Starwalker Studios and check out the video. And I am there in all my bearded glory with my glistening oiled Texas Beard Company beard. So again, texasbeardcompany.com, coupon code GameMaster for 15% off. Now, obviously, you've probably had a lot of practice and experience with running improvised games. Now that you're kind of comfortable with it, do you think it's more or less work or the same during the actual session to run an improvised versus a more scripted game?
I think during the actual session, it's about the same.
Okay.
But and to be honest, I am in the middle between running scripted content and improvised content.
Okay.
I like to have set locations that have like traditional dungeon environments with a map and creatures and interesting locations and traps, all the regular stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. That's fun to have. But I might not set that in any particular locale in a greater game setting.
Okay.
So at the table, I'd like to have a number of things ready to go. Some set locations, some index cards with just random encounters or ideas, themes. And again, Dungeon World articulated this for me in a way that I thought was very surprising, in that I had already been doing things intuitively in a certain way, and then to find it codified in their system, that was pretty fascinating. Personally, it's a lot more work for me to work with very scripted content.
Yeah.
It's not my natural mode. I did it a lot in the 90s with Call of Cthulhu stuff.
Okay.
But even then, we would deviate significantly from what was written and then eventually come back.
Yeah, I found the same thing. As you mentioned, I'm running Tyranny of Dragons, and I find that a lot of times I feel like, oh, I need to look something up, which I hate to do in the middle of a session, where when I'm running something I came up with myself, either I remember what the thing is or I just don't care and make something else up. But with scripted stuff, I feel less free to do that.
But the payoff is that the level of cinematic effect, and by that I mean scenes leading into other scenes, leading into other chapters, going to some eventual payoff at the end, that is easier to do with something scripted than it is with something improvised.
Sure. And I think the great place to be is kind of like what you say you're doing, where you're somewhere in the middle. So you're getting kind of the benefits of both.
Yes. Another game that I have recently discovered is The Strange.
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, as well I know. That game is completely opening up my mind to being able to run multi-setting, multi-genre adventures in a fun way that is supported by the rules. And I've tried doing this over the years with different systems to varying degrees of success, but the way The Strange has built it is very, very clever. And really anything I can think of, have read about, or want to use is fair game in The Strange.
Yeah, and that system, the Cypher system, is relatively easy to wrap your head around and be able to improvise with. I know running Numenera was really the first time I even considered doing a more improvised game, just because it seemed like it would be easier to do than with like D&D or Pathfinder or something like that.
It'd be hard to do with Pathfinder.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that in Dungeon World, there were some specific techniques that they codified that you found really helpful. Can you remember any examples of those?
Well, this notion of play to find out what happens is really the core of it.
Okay.
And there's a chapter in the book that's called, I think, First Session or something like that. And it says, don't prepare anything. Show up and ask the players questions about their characters or what they think the world looks like. And just write that stuff down.
Okay.
So that was amazing to me. Like, it got all of the stress about having to prepare for a session out of my system.
Yeah.
And I'll stress about it. I want it to be a great game. I want everyone to have a great time. I want to be comfortable. So I'll just kind of be neurotic about over preparing, you know?
It sounds familiar to me.
So this new wave of games are asking you to do less prep and allow the players to guide where things are going. So that's the first session chapter in Dungeon World. And then they have this notion of what they call fronts.
Yes.
And fronts are just really bullet lists of ideas of things that could happen in a session. And they're divided into adventures and campaign fronts. And there's a certain amount of flexibility between those two things. But really, if you have a good list of things that can happen in a session and maybe a set location or two, or just a few things in your back pocket, I think that it's really easy to run a mostly improvised setting or session in a setting that you're familiar with.
Very cool.
And Dungeon World is, it's bog standard fantasy for the most part.
Awesome.
In the core book.
So for a GM listening who's maybe considering trying this for the first time, is Dungeon World a game you would recommend for them to try this with?
I would absolutely recommend Dungeon World as a starting place. I would recommend Fate as well.
Okay.
And I would recommend any of the new Monty Cook games. But Dungeon World is very simple and is more mechanics light than most things that you'll see.
Very cool. I just actually got together with some players last night for a Star Wars campaign I'm putting together. And I kind of did some of what you were just talking about, where I had some general ideas for things I might want to do with the campaign, but I pretty much went to the first session, which was character creation, and just kind of waited to see what kind of characters they would make, and then tried to find ways to kind of tie their backgrounds together and give me some ideas of where to go with it. But I'm a little concerned the system might be a little too involved to improvise super well. We'll see.
I think it just takes practice.
Yeah, sure.
That's like saying the saxophone has too many keys for a jazz musician to successfully improvise with. Well, if a jazz musician sits down and practices, several hours a day for an unspecified amount of time, then if that person really wants to be successful as an improviser on that instrument, it's going to happen.
Yeah. As a trumpet player, I do feel the sax has way too many keys, but...
I mean, I think you saw the beginnings of this movement toward improvisation and gaming all along. I mean, in the 70s, I think people were making stuff up like crazy because there was no codified way of doing things. I think in the 80s, things became increasingly more formal, and then the storyteller system came out with Ars Magica, and then that morphed into Vampire and all the rest, which I think are very heavily improvised types of games.
Yeah.
And then, 3E came out, and I think everything quickly moved back to more scripted content.
Yeah.
Are you going to edit out the potential addition more segment?
No. How would you say that they differ, improvised versus scripted games?
Well, with contemporary products, I think the difference is easy to spot. For example, the new 5e campaigns are scripted because the publishers need to have something to sell to game masters to run in their home campaigns.
Sure.
So I think they're very well done, and it's very clear what is expected of the game master and what locations, non-player characters, etc. are going to be presented. But really, this is no different than going back to, for example, Keep on the Borderlands, which is also very scripted in the sense that it has locations, advice to the game master, and the rest. This gets into the notion of what's the difference between a sandbox game and a scripted, tightly scripted, or some would say railroaded game.
Okay.
And that is probably a pretty big discussion. But I think with the notion of a sandbox game, you're getting back into the realm of improvisation.
Definitely, yeah.
In that you have islands of scripted content, metaphorically, and your players are free to move about them as they will. And for me personally, that's the sweet spot. But again, with this Dungeon World thing, since I've just recently encountered it and am impressed by it, I keep going back to it. But at the beginning of that game, you co-create the setting with the players. And I think that is an innovation.
Yeah, that's cool.
It isn't an innovation unique to Dungeon World because Fate is doing a similar thing.
Yes.
But it is an innovation in this wave of contemporary games that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really cool thing to do. Not only does it take some of the load off the GM's shoulders, but I think it can greatly increase player buy-in, if they get to help create the setting that they're going to be playing in.
Absolutely. I think that it's what is underlying all of this is, the way I observe it, a shift from the game master, judge, referee, dungeon master, whatever, being the all-knowing, omnipotent god of the game.
Yeah.
Which is cool. That's a cool model. And if you're Mar Barker running Empire of the Petal Throne, that's... no one else can do that like he can do that. However, lately, it seems that there is a lot of leveling the playing field with regard to having the game master be more of a switchboard operator who is routing all of this creative traffic that's happening between all of the players. It's really giving more agency and recognition to the player as being just as important and creative as the game master.
Yeah.
And that is definitely different than the, mythical mega dungeon model of the 70s where 10 went in and 3 came out, and that's cool. And that's how Dungeon Crawl Classics role-playing game is doing it. And that's cool because they're saying that it's 1974. I get it. I like that game. I play a lot of it. But for the way I run games, that's not really the way I roll, as they say. Right?
Very fitting. I love your metaphors, by the way. You have some great metaphors.
Thank you. That's because I'm a tarot reader, a musician, and a role-playing games enthusiast. So
makes sense.
My brain is full of too many things.
That's going to wrap up episode 45 of Game Master's Journey. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining me on the Obsidian Monolith today. Thank you again to Scott Kellogg for sharing your time with me and providing us with this great information. And be sure to come back for episode 46 for the second part of the interview. If you would like to check out Scott's music, you can find that at scottkellogg.bandcamp.com, and I will have that link and other links in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com, and you can check out his music there. Really cool stuff. You can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can find me on Google+, just search for Lex Starwalker, and you can follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. I am everywhere on the internet. You can and will find me. Please visit the website, starwalkerstudios.com, and that is the hub for all Starwalker Studios goodness. You can find all my podcasts there. In the show notes, you can find links to all the great ways that you can help support the show and support Starwalker Studios, including a Patreon button that will take you to our brand new Patreon page that you can check out. Also, donate button, iTunes and Stitcher buttons if you want to go to iTunes or Stitcher and subscribe or leave a review, or better yet, both. And those are all at the top of the show notes, and at the bottom of the show notes, you can find a link to our Google Plus community where you can connect with other gamers and nerds. And you can find links to my YouTube and Twitch channels, as well as a link to a free 30-day trial of Audible books that you can receive courtesy of Game Master's Journey, and Amazon referral link. So all kinds of great stuff at starwalkerstudios.com. Definitely head over there every once in a while, even if you've been there before, because you never know when I might be launching a new podcast. Teaser. So I hope you had a chance to play your favorite RPG this week, or I hope that you will. And I will be back next week with another episode of Game Master's Journey and the conclusion of this excellent interview with Scott. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.